Well, there's a story that's been around for the last 50 years or so. And it started with this 15-year-old girl who was growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And one day she was out with a friend or two, and they were just kind of minding their own business, as 15-year-olds do. When out of nowhere, this group of guys from their high school pulled up. And these are the nice, good-looking, popular, well-to-do kind of boys. And they came up, and out of nowhere, they just jumped on one of this girl's friends and started beating on him mercilessly. And it was really for no reason that they could perceive. And there was one word that they kept saying over and over and over again to this boy. And that word was greaser. And this became an experience that this girl would never forget. And so she dealt with it in the only way she knew how. And she went home and she wrote, and she wrote, and she wrote, and she wrote, and she created this entire fictional story around the experience that she just had. She finished this story when she was 16 and still in high school. And by the time she graduated high school in Tulsa in 1967, this story had found its way to a publisher. And the name of the book was called The Outsiders. And with The Outsiders, she chose to tell this story from the viewpoint of one person named Pony Boy, who was a greaser. And him and his group of friends were constantly butting heads with another group of people called the Socias. The greasers always felt like they were outsiders, like they were on the outside looking in, as if the whole world revolved around what the Socias wanted and what the Socias wanted to do. And there wasn't room for them. And all they wanted to do was to have others accept them for who they were. The book became so popular that middle schoolers and high schoolers around the US have been reading this book in school. And in 1983, a movie was made of the same name, The Outsiders. It's become a tale beyond time as it pulls on the heartstrings of us as the reader or the listener, because we too often find ourselves in a place where we either want to belong or we want to be accepted, but we don't always feel like we're in a place where we can be. And today we're going to dive into Acts chapter 10, and we're going to look at another outsider, one that we may not talk about quite as often, one that's not always on the forefront of our mind like others that may exist. But this outsider truly was an outsider as well. In fact, there were two major groups of people, and he didn't fit with either of them. And his name was Cornelius. See, Cornelius was a Gentile. In Israel at that time, there were really two groups of people. Instead of the greasers and the Socias, it was the Gentiles and the Jews. All that a Gentile was a non-Hebrew, a non-Jew. But the tough thing for Cornelius wasn't just that he was a Gentile, but he had completely adopted the religion of the Jews around him. See, Cornelius is explained as a God-fearing Gentile. Some in that time would have thought, does such a thing even exist? But what was tough for Cornelius was, even though he believed in God and he believed in the Yahweh that the Jews talked about, there were so many rules and regulations and laws that stopped him from going further. He wasn't allowed to go into the synagogue or the temple. He wasn't allowed to go into the homes of other Jews. They could have commerce or they could talk on the street, but that really was kind of it. And so Cornelius longed for God, and he was a good man who did a lot of good things. And God saw him. He saw that Cornelius was on the outside looking in. And so God gave this incredible dream to Peter and sent Peter directly to the home of Cornelius. And Peter crossed that line into his home. And the first time he had ever done it in his life. And he told Cornelius and his entire family about Jesus. And that salvation had come. And it says that Cornelius and his whole household believed. They believed that the Messiah was Jesus, that salvation had come through Jesus. They believed in the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. And then it even says that they were at that moment also filled with the Holy Spirit. Peter was taken aback that this outsider was brought in by God. Today we start a new series called Get Deeper. And over the next few weeks, we're going to explore this idea of what does it mean to get deeper with God? What does it mean to get deeper in our faith? This series is really, it's exploring that yearning inside of all of us of wanting to be meant for something more. Like that question of, is this really all that there is? Or is there more? Like, God, what do you really want from me? I'm, sitting here, I'm 15 years old, I'm 25, I'm 35 or 70 or whatever age. And it feels like there's still so much more to do. And it's like, God, is this it? Or is there more? So when it comes to getting deeper in our faith, it really comes down to finding out your why. Let's find your why. Why did God put you here? There are some who say there are two incredibly important days in anyone's life. The first is the day that you were born. And the second is the day that you find out. Well, today and through this series, we're going to find out why. We're going to get deeper in your faith, in your relationship with God. In this process of getting deeper, it starts by thinking like an outsider. It starts by learning to think like someone from the novel or the movie written by S.E. Hinton. It's the process of putting yourself in Cornelius's shoes and trying to see what he sees. It's the process of looking at the world around you and saying, I don't feel like I belong here. So there's two ways that we can start thinking like an outsider. The first is by what we're going to call looking out the window. And the second is going to be fighting for clarity. So what do these mean? Look out the window and see the world. Observe things. Observe what's going on in the world around you. Observe what's going on in your friendships or relationships or culture or community or country. Look what's going on in your world. And as you look at those things, what's bothering you? What's hurting you? What's making you stay up at night? Or what's just something that you look at and you're just like, this isn't right. And when you can look at that and you can look out the window and see something that just shouldn't be, you can find what shouldn't be and you can start to change it into what it should be. And the second way that we can think like an outsider is to fight for clarity. Okay, so what does fighting for clarity mean? It means this. It means that when you look out the window and you see the problem or you see something, you've observed something that you want to change. Now you have to figure out what that means. You've got to fight to make it clear. The first thing that we do is we seek God in that. There's no better way to find clarity in your life than by seeking God on a regular basis. Here's the problem. And I'm going to look through my window right now, by the way. I'm going to look through my window and I'm going to look at, for lack of a better phrase, the American church. Now, I'm generalizing. There are great churches out there and every church has great people and great disciples in it. But there seems to be this thing happening in the modern American church, which is we're not seeking God regularly. We're not getting on our knees or spending the time that we need to with God on a regular basis. So how could we possibly claim to follow God if we don't even spend time with him or actually follow him? But instead, what we tend to do is we wait until it's convenient for us. Or I'm going to step on toes. Or we simply are just using God. We're using God to solve our problems when they're too big for us. We're using God to make us feel better when we hurt or something doesn't go right, which is usually a result of our own bad decision that we didn't seek God for in the first place, right? The truth is, I think in a lot of ways, we tend to treat God like we do our parents, or at least family members in our life. What I mean by that is, as a child, we go to our parents when we need something. It's this selfish mentality of, I need this or I want that, so I'm going to go to my mom or dad, whether it's love, affection, a new toy, an adventure, some new clothes, or something for school. But the rest of the time, we often push them away until we need them again. But just like any good, decent parent out there, they love their children through it anyway. And they raise them to the best of their ability anyway. So seek God. Find clarity to what you see out the window by seeking God. And the other way to seek clarity, to find that and fight for that clarity, is to change the question. Here's what happens so often when we look out the window. We see something we don't like and we want to change it. Just a few days ago, within the last week or so, my wife, Jen, is holding our youngest. Her name is Emery. And she's holding Emery. And Emery has this thing. She's 2.5. She looks at me and she just makes these like googly eyes. It's like, it's Daddy. And her whole demeanor will change. So Jen's holding her and Emery just looks at me and she's like, just making these eyes. And Jen just laughed about it. And I jokingly said to Jen, you know, Jen, I remember a time when you used to look at me like that. Like you were so excited that I was there. You couldn't wait to spend more time with me. You felt so lucky just to be around me. And she looked at me without thinking, without blinking, deadpan. She was like, yeah, then I got to know you. I'm like, all right, well, point for Jen. She wins. I could look at that situation and I could say, Jen, why don't you look at me like that anymore? Or I could change the question and say, what do I need to do to love and cherish my wife enough so that she will look at me like that again? Or instead of asking the question of like, why won't my kid behave? Why won't my kid come home at curfew? Why won't my kid go to bed on time? Why won't my kid pee on the toilet? Why won't my kid stop disrespecting me? Or what can I do to get my kid to actually listen to me? Well, instead of those questions, what if we changed the question and we looked at it differently and said, who is it that I want my child to become? And then what do I need to do to teach that and to reinforce that? Or maybe the question is, why can't I get promoted at work? And maybe you're putting the blame on management or you're putting blame on somebody else. Well, what if you change the question to say, what do I need to do to stand apart further? Or we could change the question even further to say, what is it that God has gifted me to do? Because maybe I'm not even in the right place. Or change the question even bigger and say, what are skills that I want to have in my life, regardless of job, regardless of career? Who do I want to be? And how can I become that? What steps do I need to take? Change the question. See, by changing the question, what we do is we change our focus from something small to something big. And when we seek God and change the question together, that is how we fight for clarity. And when we look through the window and we fight for clarity, we can start to think like an outsider so that we can find why God has created us exactly the way that we are. Truth is, it's not that hard to think like an outsider because you already are an outsider. Just by being a follower of Jesus, you're already different than everyone else. You're already on the outside looking in. The difference is we don't want to be on the inside. A.W. Tozer says it really well. He says, modern Christians hope to save the world by being like it, but it will never work because we were never supposed to be like this world. In 1 John, the author writes this, and let me read this to you. It says in 1 John 2:15, do not love this world nor the things it offers you. For when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. In other words, when we love the world or we want to be like the world, we cannot love the Father because they are opposite things. Jesus says elsewhere, you cannot serve two masters. Here's what Peter writes in 1 Peter 2:11 and 12. He says, dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. You are not of this world. You are an outsider. By following Jesus, you are an outsider. Paul writes in Romans 12:2, he says, do not conform to this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't conform to what you see around you, because you were created for something different. So own it. Think like an outsider. Own the fact that you do not belong in this world. To get deeper, it starts by thinking like an outsider, looking through the window and fighting for that clarity, to know what it is that God has placed you here. And it sounds simple. I'm not going to tell you it's that simple. For many of us, this is a lifetime pursuit. But as we get deeper over these next few weeks, we're going to slowly unpack a little bit more at a time. So as you find that why, it's easier to respond to God. It's easier to trust Him or to seek Him. Because now it brings a whole new meaning to the phrase that we're just getting started.